Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review the 2002 movie, The Time Machine. So, I had recently watched the episode of Doctor Strange's What If, and immediately when watching that movie, immediately I thought of this film. Or, immediately once I watched that episode of that show, I went and I was like, okay, this feels just like this movie. And so I was like, F it, let's go and let's review this film. It's been a long time for me. I don't remember like a bulk of this film. I remember like what is to be the end goal of it, and I remember bits and pieces about it. But heaven forbid you actually tell me like to say like, oh, what all happens in here. I just be like, I just remember like small tidbits and whatever. So eventually I went to rewatch it to remember more and to regale you about what I felt about this movie. I thought that this movie was rather fun. It does kind of have a meaningless goal. It does eventually just go on to have us just eventually leave our main character eventually stranded towards the end. But then again, fun film, enjoyable thing to have been put together. So, like, and it's also kind of a fun time traveling kind of thing, because when looking at it, I went back to watch a movie that was supposedly done in 2002 that mostly focuses on a time period of 1899. So, like, I guess they tried to get that perfectly done, and then you in this movie are to see what 2030 is to supposedly look like, which I'm like, I'm sorry, but I don't think 2030 is going to look like that kind of 2030. Like, that seems to be like a couple hundred, like maybe another 100 years in the time of which that maybe we can get there. I don't think we're going to get there in the next like small a number of years. Let's just say for safety's sake. So this movie was to be fun. But yeah, so like the very beginning of this movie starts out in 1819, but eventually doesn't like we don't really get till time travel to X amount of years later, but anyways, it's regardless. So, how did I feel about this movie? I would say that this is a solid okay film. Like, to me, like, I wish that we could have actually hopped around time more. I wish there could have actually been like something more than just what the goal was of this film. Because here is really the goal. So we have our main character, who of course is to be Alexander, who is to try and prevent the death of his wife, or future wife, which is to be Emma. And so he is to desperately come up with a time machine to prevent her death. But Alexander, for every time he is to try to go back into the past to try and prevent Emma's death, where there is death, there is always death. So Alexander now has to go into the future to figure out why he can't prevent the love of his life's death. And so he goes further and further and further, seemingly into the future, to try to have someone smart enough that will know this answer. And it seems that eventually he might come up with this answer by the end of this film. But then eventually he is to also realize something else, that maybe he doesn't need, shortly thereafter, maybe he doesn't need a time machine. Maybe he doesn't need, maybe if he has something perfect, something good, something that he can be the smartest person to be able to build a world, back from once where it was, then maybe that's all that Alexander ever really needed. And so, with that, yeah, I kind of teed it up, but I also kind of just said parts of what is to happen in this movie. So, I thought this movie was fun, but it kind of made this movie also to just be like, well, we're just going to bottle this movie in its one thing. We're not going to go and do sequels of this, or we're not going to, like, it's not just going to be some fun adventure. And it also just kind of kills its own goal. You couldn't have come up with other ideas for a thing that could stretch this movie into a franchise. You had to only, like, bottle it into one film because it was kind of an easy answer. But anyways, so I think it's that coveted time to go into spoilers about this movie. It's about that time again to go into what is to be spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about the time again to spoil this movie. Oh, by the way, if people are wondering where you can go to see said The Time Machine, supposedly there is this kind of premium access thing which eventually would lead to like a certain app, which I can tell you a better option. That's free. I had went and I had watched this movie on an app called Fox HD Movies. You can go in there and you can and the logo will say so, but I think the title will say like 1080p movies or something like that. Play 1080 movies or something like that. HD movies or something. But if you search the word Fox HD Movies, this app should come up fairly quickly. From what I've done that myself. So there is also this other app that I've been using fairly frequently recently to watch new releases and all kinds of things. You can go into an app called Yes Movies or Yes Movies and Shows, and you can be able, like, if you specifically go into the Yes one where it says Movies and Shows, you should be able to see pretty much everything easily for absolutely free. Like new releases, latest movies, latest shows, or the most thing that has been viewed upon that app. So, in fact, let's go into it. Let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about to having to spoil this movie. So, very beginning of this. So, the time period is to be 1899. So, Alex is to be going and scribbling upon his chalkboard, not even thinking that he is to be late for something. So we have his best friend that is to be David Philby, guy from Game of Thrones, or the Full Monty, if you guys remember that movie. The Full Monty, you guys remember that? Strutting it out. So David is to tell, of course, Alexander, it's like, aren't you going to probably soon be late for something? And Alexander is like, what time is it? And so David is like, well, about 5 o'clock. So David is to be really realizing that he is going to possibly be late to be with Emma. And so Alexander is to rush home to change his clothes and to coincidentally still smell like chalk, the alluring scent of aroma of chalk. So we have this this woman who is to seemingly be, I would assess, Alexander's maid or like assistant. This woman called Miss Watchett, or Watchett, which seems like a weird, goofy name. So I would have said it would have been Watchkins or something, but Watchett. Her name is Watchett. Whatever. Anyways, so Alex is to eventually scramble, try to get some new clothes on, and eventually he is to scramble almost out the door without his engagement ring, which is to supposedly be a moon ring, which is to, or a moonstone, which is to tie into supposedly Emma's, like, of course, birth month. So Alexander is to go out and want to eventually go and buy Emma some flowers, but then eventually he ends up seeing this weird and wild device, which seems almost close to an automotive mobile of sorts, but like it keeps breaking down. But I guess what Alexander is to really see here could be possibly the prototype of what could eventually be the time machine. So, but Alex is to go and walk off to eventually talk to Emma because he's almost kind of forgot about her because any interesting invention Alexander is just glued to. So Alexander is to make his way to Emma, and so eventually they are to have a fun time at the place they are at, and so they are to end up walking off. All of a sudden, we have Emma who is asking Alexander, it's like, you're shivering. I hope you're not coming down with something. I'm like, it's freaking cold out. Like, do you not see the snow? Anybody would be shivering because they're freaking cold. Is anybody calculating that? Like, unless you live in a northern state or an environment of which cold is the normal, which that would probably be beneficial to me, because freaking I love to be cold. I'd rather be cold than just, like, sweating my bushwhackle off. Just sweating everywhere. Just pouring down with the sweatness. Everybody get down with the sweatness, because it's, like, pouring down. Good God. So, cold is the new bold, if that's what you say. Anyways, so Emma is to tell, again, let's reiterate, Emma is to tell Alexander, it's like, well, I hope you're not coming down with something. And funny enough, Alex is to say, like, yeah, like, I think the only cure of which that could help me is if you are to marry me and to live with me for the rest of my life. And then he is to eventually just kind of like try and find where the wedding ring is, and he's taken forever to figure out where he is. He's like touching all his pockets. And so he's to propose, and Emma's to be like waiting for the ring, and then he's trying to figure out where like the thing is in his clothes, and he gets it out, and then he ends up proposing to her. So Emma is of course to take the ring, and I believe she ends up saying yes. I'm not quite sure. And so all of a sudden we have a robber that is to come out of the shadows and be like, well, hey, like this is so wonderful. This is like almost brought me to tears. Well, here's the thing, I hate to do this to you, but like I'm gonna need your wallet. I'm gonna need all of your jewelry. I'm gonna need your watch. I'm gonna need everything. And so all of a sudden, this guy has to toss out a gun, and so Alexander and this guy are to wrestle with it because the guy is to also ask for the wedding ring because this guy is to say, well, maybe he'll buy you a diamond later, because Alexander was to say, like, well, I didn't get you a diamond, but I got you something that I thought was much more like of a smarter thing to do to get you actually a moonstone, which is actually like tied to your horoscope sigil thing. So if anything, that'd be an interesting way to do. Anyways, pushing on. So so all of a sudden, this robber is to accidentally have this gun go off, and Emma is to be shot and to be killed. And so we have Alexander, who is to just be so heartbroken that his wife is to be dead. The thief is to run off to just be like, it was only a ring. Like, yeah, like, it was only a ring, an engagement ring, and like, hey, they were willing to give everything up, but that, you should have taken all this stuff and just left, but I guess this is just not this guy. When eventually Alexander was trying to wrestle with the gun, that's when the guy should have gave up and should have ran off, but, like, or should have, like, gotten to where it didn't get that far and then just ran off, but no, that's not this guy. This guy is just like, no, I think I can Russell Wade back the gun. And just, you could have ended up shot too. Anyways, so eventually Alexander is of course to have a funeral for Emma. A ton of time has passed, about to the point of 1903 to be exactly specific. So David is to go to uh, Alexander and is to mention, hey man, like, if anything, like, don't blame yourself for what had happened. And Alexander's like, yeah, like, maybe I shouldn't blame myself. Maybe I should blame, uh, maybe I should blame the guy that made the ring. Maybe I should blame, uh, like, you for introducing me to her. Maybe I should blame everyone else for her death than me. And so David is to have, or Alexander is to have a lot more uh, chalkboards and everything like that than he's ever had before. It seems like he has a lot more scribbling going on. It seems like he's put a lot of stuff together. And so David is to realize how far gone Alex is, and how, like, Alex is to eventually not be able to move on. So David is just to move on because, like, there's nothing I can do for him anymore. Like, he's just like this one-tracked mind person. So, but David is to eventually have this goal of, I will prevent her death. Like, I will figure out how to prevent it. Because eventually Alexander is to come up with a time machine, and so he ends up going into the time machine, and he decides to go forward into time, or go back into time, to prevent this whole event from happening, from Emma's death from happening. So we also get a moment where, in some point in this movie, Alexander is to have Emma's necklace, and it is to, like, dangle on the outside of this time bubble that the time machine has created for Alexander. And so we end up finding out that this bracelet eventually is to wither away and die, but only a certain portion of it that is actually outside the time machine. But then the other part of it is to be perfectly fine, which was just kind of interesting to me. So there's probably some world out there where half of a necklace is just kind of dangling in the air for X amount of time. For whatever bizarre reason that makes no sense. So now Alexander is to go back to 1899 to prevent Emma's death. So Alexander is to go right where Alex is and eventually take her on to be away from where they were, from preventing themselves from getting mugged and getting shot. So Alexander is to take Emma on this other part of town where eventually Emma is to mention to Alex about, hey, like, could you get me some flowers? And Alex is to run to get her some flowers, just thinking, like, I've done it, like, I've saved her. Alex is to also tell Emma, like, before he goes and gets the flowers, for her to just run on home. And eventually a variation of Alexander will eventually meet her and mention how he was, like, that she was not actually there of where he was to be. here's also the interesting thing. What if Alexander were to try and go and find Emma, and Alexander were to end up getting shot in the process? Wouldn't that have been an interesting story where Alexander were to have tried to prevent Emma's death and then just created his own death? Wouldn't that be interesting? Then who would go back in time? And plus also that would create a thing that cannot happen either, because like if Alexander were to die, then like he would never be able to have created the time machine. Would have Emma have created the time machine? That seems like a weird thing. That's why you don't go back into past. It's probably better to go forward into time. So what ends up happening is Alexander is going and getting some roses to all of a sudden see that Emma is to get run down by a machine. I believe it was a horse and buggy, but it also looks like the machine from that one guy from the previous part where his vehicle, his weird goofy vehicle, was to break down, and I think this guy might have accidentally ran her over while this guy's car was to malfunction and run her down. So Alexander is to now realize that when there is death, there is to always be death, and that really Alexander could go back 1,000 different times, and Emma will always find a way to die every single way. I'm like, well, wait a minute. What if you do this one thing? What if you go and you take Emma, put her in your time machine, and you just fast track it to the year of which that you were to have been, like, gone. Like, say, for example, if Alexander were to take Emma, put her and him in the time machine, go forward into 1903, like the exact day after that Alexander had went back in time, wouldn't that prevent everything? And wouldn't that have been the way to prevent Emma's death? Because what would happen right thereafter? Like, would Emma still have found a way to die in a new time period? Because I'm just kind of wondering if it were to happen on just that day alone, or I'm just kind of curious if, like, Emma was to be reserved to die within like a time. So like that's what kind of gets me to where I'm just like, okay, does it come down to that one day, or will it just come down to Emma has to die regardless of time period, regardless of whatever, she, like, it's just her time? So because you would have thought that maybe like Alexander would have tried that to see if Alexander or Emma would have died with in being in 1903. So, but Alexander is to assess that Emma is to die regardless. So he's just like, okay, I need to figure out a person who is to be smart enough to answer my question and to be able to figure out how I can save Emma. And so all of a sudden, we have Alexander who ends up going way further on into time. And I'm just like, dude, how are you going to be able to afford like doing any lick of anything? Because the further and further you go on into the future, like I'm assuming that you're going to have to pay to like stand up straight, like, because like I feel like anything is just gonna like have some kind of pay thing with it, and I don't think anything will just be for free. I don't think even something as simple as information eventually will be for free. And like I just don't quite understand how Alex will easily get these answers and he'll just tell people, "Oh yeah, I'm just a guy from 1903. Is that okay with everybody?" Like, you're a crazy loon. I would see him just immediately going into some mental hospital and him just be like toss away the key forever, and this story would have ended fairly quickly. But no, instead, Alex is to go on to 2030, and we are to find out that bizarrely these people desperately want to be going and mining onto the moon for whatever reason. And so, uh, if anything, Alexander is to head to this seemingly library, and he ends up going to this place that is to have this seemingly hologram that is to tell Alexander everything. Like, he has unlimited knowledge. So Alexander is to just say, like, okay, well, um, I would love to know information about time travel or the time machine. And so immediately the the character that is to be in this movie, who is to eventually, God, what is his name? Uh, of course, they don't have it. Why wouldn't they not have it? He's basically in most of the movie. Anyways, um, mood point. So this, I think he's a Vox or a Vox service. So eventually, this character is to tell Alexander that anything that he is to want to know information about is all science fiction. And Alexander is like, no, 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 I want real application of time travel. And the guy is just like, I'm sorry, but I can't help you. Like, anything is to be like a fabrication. None of it's actually real, legitimate, whatever. And so there is also to be things of referencing of the actual time machine, or like an actual play that I guess had really garnered the origin of this whole movie, which I really do enjoy. Like, I really like the fact that they end up kind of giving us little Easter eggs, which actually ties into the whole way of which that this eventually movie came to be, was from all this previous stuff. So really, that just pushes Alexander to just be like, well, I guess I'm still not going to get the answer, even from this distant time. And so Alexander is to go back into his machine and eventually decide to even go further forward into time, which would be 2037, which all of a sudden we are to find out, um, there is to be a lunar cataclysm, and supposedly there was something where the people were to be mining upon the earth, or mining upon the moon, and they had kind of misjudged some things, which all of a sudden is to leave the moon, I guess, to start eventually breaking into pieces, and I guess making its way onto earth, which is eventually going to take the earth down because of the moon frickin' just going and being mined too heavily. So eventually that leads. Oh, there was also this one moment where eventually Alexander was to have a sketch of what this town was to eventually look like further on in the future. And David was to make this comment about, do you ever think that we'll go way too far? And so, really, here, this is the moment where really Alexander in his mind is like, David was right all along, that they have gone way too far. And so when Alexander was to eventually be into this environment where they are grabbing Alexander to try to get him to his designated secure area. And Alexander wants to know what's going on, and they ask him, like, dude, have you been living under a rock? And he's like, yes, I have. And so they explain it to him, but he ends up running back off as these people run to their own safety, and Alexander runs back into his machine to eventually bump and smack and hit himself and to knock himself unconscious and to go even way further into time, which is supposedly have to be year 800,000, 2,000, or 802, no, 802, 701. So, like, this is 8,000 or 800,000 years into the future. I'm trying to get that right. So, now all of a sudden we have, like, freaking ice ages have happened, evolution has happened, and so weirdly now, bizarrely, Alexander is to eventually head into a time that seems to not have much information whatsoever. So, but eventually we do seemingly have one person who is to be at this time to answer, to be able to answer Alexander's questions, or answer Alexander's question. So, Alexander is to eventually just be able to rest himself, to be able to be captured by what is to be the new human race, which is to be the Elo, Eloi, Eloi. I'm probably ill-pronouncing that. So, evidently both the Morlocks and the Eloi have, like, that's, like, basically the evolutional chain of what was to come from off of the human race, I guess, weirdly enough. So, now Alexander is to eventually tie himself onto a girl named Mara, and I believe her brother or younger brother, I would assess or assume. And so Alexander is to eventually realize that it seems that these people, like, need help and they need knowledge, because it seems that only Mara is to actually know English. Everyone else knows some alternative new language that all of them are to know. And so Mara is to try and talk to Alexander and say, oh, who are you? And Alexander is like, well, I'm a time traveler. I came from the past to try to seek answers. And so Mara is to tell everybody that he bumped his head and that he's just kind of like a wandering an adventure or whatever. And everybody's like, ah, okay, whatever. So eventually they are to bandage up his ribs because evidently his ribs were to be injured. So eventually this just leads us to find out that Alexander is to have this weird, goofy dream about this seemingly monstrous machine of a thing coming and attacking him at night. Alexander is to wake up, and it seems that everyone in this town is to supposedly have the exact same dream, every single person. So he's like, well, that's kind of weird. Like, what is it, like a Nightmare on Elm Street kind of thing going on here? But no, like, it just, I think there is to be a one of the Morlocks who's to be the leader of all of them, who is to be brainly, like, forcing all these people to dream a certain way because he has that kind of power or ability or whichever. So, because it seems that the leader of the Morlocks is to have this strange ability, which we will find. So, now we eventually have the Morlocks who are to appear and to sound like oxes or bulls. Like, what freaking like monster would sound like a bull or an ox? This just sounds like an absurd sound coming from a monsterish thing. Like they should have went into the classic freaking like if you're gonna go with a sound, it might as well be the normal lion, where it actually just like you should have went with that. You shouldn't have went with the what the is that? Like I'm sorry, like I can't take a bull sounding monster seriously. I was chuckling a little bit during this part. So uh so the Morlocks, so they end up like this kind of feels like the Planet of the Apes kind of moment where all of a sudden we have these Morlocks that are like phew phew like hitting people with darts in the neck, and so they're ending up going down. Everyone's starting to scramble. It's Planet of the Apes all over again. Everybody's running, and I'm just waiting for somebody to say, "Get your hands off them, you dang dirty Morlock!" So, eventually, what is to end up happening is once they end up grabbing somebody, bizarrely they end up going into the sand and they drop into the sand, and I'm just kind of like, man, that is so weird. But eventually, Mara is one of the people who are to end up into the sand, and so Alexander is now turning to Mara's like younger brother, I'm assuming. Because Mora was to be asked by Alexander. Alexander was to say, like, well, hey, like, what happened to your parents? And Mora's like, well, we lost all of them. Like, we've lost so many people because they end up getting just collected by the Morlocks. And the Morlocks end up just feeding on these people's bones. Because eventually, when Alexander is to make his way into the Morlock headquarters or cave or wherever this is to be, when this the boy is to tell him like, hey, everybody knows where they go, but nobody wants to go there because like probably a lot of people are going to end up dead regardless. So but Alex is to also like be kind of confused because supposedly one of the Morlocks had tried to take his pocket watch. So he's like, why would they take my watch? That seems weird. There has to be some kind of thing to that. So Alex is to go on and go to this Morlock's cave location, which seems like we're gonna get a scene out of the Lord of the Rings here, where like we just see all these Morlocks and I'm just like, they look like orcs to me. Like straight up, like it feels like somebody got the idea of orcs from this movie, but I guess that's probably just me. So Alexander is to eventually just kind of head through this place and try to find where Mora is. And that eventually just leads him into this one seemingly part of a river of bones where he's to see all of these skeletons and all of these things, charred remains from humans that have died because the Morlocks have eaten all of them. So Alexander is to be swimming in a body of water of bones. So Alex is to eventually get caught by the Morlocks, chucked into this cage, and so it seems that the Morlock leader, who is to be Uber Morlock. So Uber Morlock. So this guy is to eventually just drive you anywhere you want to go. Rate me 5 stars. I'm the Uber Morlock. So the Uber Warlock is wanting to speak with Alexander because he's the only intelligent, even probably far more intelligent person than the Uber Morlock is. So eventually Alexander is defining some information about the Morlock, where the leader Morlock had mentioned that supposedly that they had spent so much time down here that eventually it became really difficult to leave. So, but this Uber Morlock just had this ability to be able to control all the Morlocks. If he didn't control them, the Morlocks would just destroy all of their food source, and eventually, like, they wouldn't be able to be anywhere close to where they actually are. So eventually, Uber Morlock is to tell Alexander the answer to his riddle. Because Uber Morlock is trying to understand why Alexander wanted to go so far into time to try and prevent his wife Emma's death. And the Uber Morlock is to tell Alexander, here's what would have happened. If you would have saved Emma, you would have had kids with her, and you would not have had the time to build this time machine because you would have had a wife, you would have had kids, you would have been too busy, you would have never put this whole thing together, you would have died, probably having blueprints to the time machine, but it would have never been put together. So, you going back to try and save Emma and accomplishing that would immediately have you not build the time machine. So Emma had to forcibly die to give you the driving force to build the time machine. So like, it's a whole event where it's like this guy had to build. So you can kind of say that every part of your life is to be forcibly planned out to a T, or everything is to bizarrely work out perfectly. Because reasonably, like, you could also say that Alexander had to put together the time machine for a reason, aka movie, because movie title, and or otherwise we would have just seen a guy that just saves his wife and just lives. What a movie would that have been? He had the time machine where a guy just goes back in time, saves his life, or saves his wife's life, and then just lives. That's it. Like, they don't go and explore time, they don't do anything because they just live. Like, they just live, they get old, they die. Alexander goes and hands out the time machine to his kids, and then his kids go back in time or go forward in time to do any goofy things, adventures, or whatever. You would have thought maybe he would have left like a secondary time machine for someone else to stumble upon to create sequel, but no. Like a prototype time machine, maybe? I don't know. But so Alexander is to realize that this guy is correct, that this guy is right, that really there was no way for Alexander to have saved his wife and created the time machine. So here's also the thing. Alex also is to have future knowledge of things. And he is to have quite a bit of future knowledge to understand what is eventually going to be going on in the future. And so now Alex cannot actually justify going back into the past to just be like, well, I guess I'm just going to live the rest of my life in the same place of which I was at. And for Alex to probably go further on to the future, in which that he does, he realizes that eventually, like, what is to just lead him into further on being into the future, which is to actually be 6,035,427,810, because eventually Alexander is to trick Uber Morlock to eventually hold on to Alexander's neck. And so Alexander is to push forward in time to create Uber Morlock's death to speed it up. So when eventually Alexander does go and look further, way further into the future, he just finds the Morlocks are to rule the Earth, and that basically Alexander realizes that Mora needs his help to have the Earth not ending up being run by Morlocks, or to eventually just realize where he's really needed to be with Mora. So Alexander goes back, and eventually the Morlocks are to run in on both Mora and Alexander. And so we have Alexander, who is to trap all the Morlocks into this one spot and create this time machine to be a bomb that is to kill every single one of these Morlocks. So then the Morlocks will never rule over Earth. And so now Alexander is to eventually go on and to, like, kind of telling both Mora and her brother kind of how his life was like. And maybe eventually they'll get to a point where eventually they'll rebuild everything. They'll get to a point of figuring everything out, because Alexander will know things about the past that can help them rebuild their future. So we also had the spot where Alexander was to also go and re-find the Vox thing, the hologram, because Alexander is to find out that seemingly this part of this library still exists, and there seems to have been a hologram that was to still be able to exist, that has all of this book knowledge, and it still is to be a living thing. So Alexander is to eventually figure out where the headquarters are, because of the hologram who had talked to somebody who had told him all about where the Morlocks was. So the little kid didn't exactly tell Alexander where to go, but the kid took Alexander to the hologram that, of course, was to know where the headquarters was, which eventually helped Alexander head that way. So the hologram was to mention that he remembered, like, every single bit of everything that had happened in the past, and of course he even remembered Alexander asking about time travel, the actual legitimate thing. So that is to lead us on to also having Mora, like, having this one spot where there's a bunch of just written words all over the place, where eventually Alexander is to read them all off, and he is to ask Mora, like, why did you keep all of this? And Mora's just like, well, because technically it's history, or technically it's just some random things that they probably just plopped out. They didn't know the difference. They didn't know what it actually meant or what it really was. So Yeah. Like, I think I covered most of this movie, but I think there might have been something that slipped somewhere. But if that was bound to happen. Oh, so Alexander was to be into the future time, and eventually we go all the way back to 1903, where David is to eventually realize uh, that Alexander is probably never really coming back. And so David is talking to Mrs. Watchett and is to say, like, hey, how about you go and you live with me and maybe you can be like my assistant via my home. And she's like, well, I don't know about that. And like, yeah, I'm sure you're going to end up there because where else are you going to end up? Because it doesn't seem like you're going to get any paychecks coming anytime soon from Alexander because he's gone. So really at the very end of this movie, we have David who ends up taking his hat and like chucking it aside and just kind of like walking off, I guess to throw caution to the wind. And so, yeah, that's just what ends up happening to this movie. Like, so fun film. I overall enjoyed it, but then again, some people may have different opinions about this movie. Some people may thought it would be goofy or stupid or whatever, which is perfectly fine. Because at the end of the day, I'm going to say goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.